Hello and welcome to By the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today we continue our course on truth, justice, and leadership with a study of Thomas Aquinas. In previous episodes, we looked at Aquinas' thoughts on faith and reason and on the nature of good and evil. And then finally, we looked at the relationship of the passions to reason. And this is all giving us the building blocks for his understanding of the virtues. So today we're going to get into the cardinal virtues and see how they are the hinges on which all the other virtues turn. So what do we mean by the cardinal virtues? We may be familiar with this expression. Literally, in the Latin, cardinal means a hinge. So it means that all virtue depends upon these four that are identified going all the way back to Plato and even earlier. And sometimes different terms are used for these four, but the first would be prudence or wisdom. The second would be justice. The next would be moderation or temperance. And finally, courage or fortitude. So those are traditionally identified as the four cardinal virtues. And here Aquinas refers to them as the principal virtues. So the ones that come first and the ones that govern, the ones that are the most important. And as we'll see in the next episode, there are some higher virtues than these, the supernatural virtues. But these are the four, you could say, natural and principal virtues that come from just the design of human nature itself. So when we're operating at our peak condition as human beings, and this means, as we'll see, that passion and reason are working at their best and they're working in harmony with each other, then this is the result. And these four virtues are going to give us, in a sense, a kind of an outline of what virtue looks like. Although if you consider that basic idea of virtue as the perfection of our nature and therefore the perfection of our capacities to reason and to direct our passions in the right way, then there are many, many different virtues that we could identify, many different ways that we can perfect those things. But these are the primary ones, and the ones that, in a certain sense, all of the other virtues are referred back to these. So if we look at Aquinas' on the contrary, the objections are giving various reasons why these would not be the cardinal virtues, specifically by identifying some other virtues that may be more important. But we're going to look at some of those virtues later. So for now, we're just going to jump into why Aquinas considers these to be the cardinal virtues. In his On the Contrary, interestingly, Aquinas cites Cicero as the authority for this. And I find that fascinating because we could trace this idea in terms of philosophical treatises, at least back to Plato. And it's not so prominent in Aristotle, which is quite interesting. Cicero, as a Roman philosopher, is, in a sense, integrating Plato and Aristotle. And in doing so, they're very Aristotelian features to the way he looks at virtue, but he uses the four cardinal virtues that Aristotle does not, and in that he's following Plato. So I do find it interesting that Aquinas, who generally leans pretty heavily on Aristotle, and sometimes also will dip into Plato for some things, but here he uses Cicero, who is synthesizing those philosophers, as in a sense, the most authoritative spokesperson when it comes to what we're talking about. And Cicero, Aquinas says, reduces all the other virtues to these four. What does that mean? It doesn't mean the other virtues don't exist. To reduce in Latin is literally to lead back. So you could say he connects all the other virtues to these four. As we'll see in a few minutes, there's two different ways that these virtues can be connected to the other virtues. And Aquinas isn't going to pick just one. He's going to say both of these make sense. So the essential point to start with is simply that these are the four virtues upon which all the other virtues depend, or to which all the other virtues connect in some way. So how are these identified as such? Why would we have four, not one or three or something like that? As we dip into his answer, which as we'll see is a complex answer, he starts by saying that these four are reckoned as cardinal virtues in respect of the four formal principles of virtue as we understand it now. So there are four cardinal virtues because virtue itself as a concept has four formal principles. That is, a formal principle, a principle is a beginning point, as we've talked about before. But in the case of defining something, you could say four essential features or four things that make virtue virtuous, four things that actually bring out the perfection. What makes this a perfection? So if we dig underneath that, it's basically four things about human nature and its operations that could be perfected. So there's four different ways that our operations can be perfect, in other words. These principles are found chiefly in certain acts and passions. Now, why does he not mention reason? Well, it's understood that the definition of virtue is the application of reason. So what's going to differentiate different virtues is not going to be reason itself, because reason is always there with virtue. What will differentiate virtue is to what is reason being directed, and through what is it being directed. So what particular application of reason are we talking about? And so in different acts and passions are going to be the different occasions, if you will, for us to be reasoning or applying reason to our actions. Now, the first of these principles that he talks about, his statement is deceptively short here, but he's referring back to some earlier discussions, so it's actually compressing a number of concepts. And we won't try to unpack all of the nuances of, he's making distinctions about different aspects of the reasoning process. So he starts with reason itself and how reason operates. But notice that the controlling, the governing concept behind this analysis is the good. And that's because we're talking about human action, the purpose of which is to achieve the good, which we had broken down earlier, what Aquinas means by that. And so the importance of reason in terms of formally defining virtue and what makes something virtuous is that reason helps us to identify what is good. And that includes some different, pieces. So counsel and judgment he refers to here. So looking at what are the possible answers to what's good, what are the possible solutions to that problem, and judgment to actually evaluate and settle on the best answer. But command is when we translate this into action. So I'm going to act upon the counsel and the judgment. I'm going to actually implement the good that I'm thinking about. And since we're talking about practical reasoning for the sake of action, it's that command which is the essential thing. And the point here is that this is Aquinas' explanation of the virtue of prudence. And as I said, we can sometimes talk about wisdom as being the first of the cardinal virtues, but Aquinas here is looking at prudence in the sense that prudence is it's dominantly looking at reasoning well about complex problems when we're faced with practical problems where the difficulty is primarily thinking through what is the best thing to do. Because of the complexity of the situation, it's not evident what is the best thing, and this requires prudence to figure out what the best thing would be. But even though the emphasis is on the thought process, the reasoning, because in this case, because the reasoning is difficult, and it requires virtue, it requires perfection in reasoning to be able to solve the problem. But the goodness of it, since we're talking about actions, is still based on the command, the actual translation into action. So that's the first. Prudence is a perfection of reasoning itself as applied to the choice of actions. Aquinas now goes through the other cardinal virtues. These virtues are not going to be about reasoning itself as applied to action, as prudence is. They're going to be about some other aspect of how we apply reason to action. And first he says, the good as defined by reason and put into our operations as something right and due is found chiefly in commutations and distributions in respect of another person and on a basis of equality. So again, he's packing a lot in there because these are things that he breaks down and looks at in detail elsewhere. For now, he's just trying to understand why these are the primary virtues. So he's compressing a lot of things into each one. But the virtue that he's referring to here is justice. Justice is the virtue by which we give to others what is due to them. And of course, that can vary in a lot of different circumstances depending what we owe to whom. But this is a virtue, and it's a cardinal virtue because it captures something essential about the nature of acting reasonably. Part of what it means to act reasonably is that since we exist in relationship to others, it's not always the primary focus of our actions, but sometimes it is the primary focus of our actions. How do they affect others? We're doing something that clearly has an effect on others, and we need to make sure that it's just, that it measures up to what we owe these other people. So to do anything harmful, to another human being, for example, is not respectful of who they are as a human being. This would be a violation of justice. So justice is based on reason because we need to be able to understand these relationships and what they are and what they entail. So what do I owe to whom and for what reason? What are the reasons behind that? And he talks about commutations. That basically means exchanges. So, if it's a matter of business or commerce or other things where we're doing, exchanges of goods, then that is the principle that we have to look at is what is this, the value of this exchange, and what is it that I owe to somebody on that basis. Distributions can come up in some different contexts, but basically when you have an authority who's presiding over a number of people, so whether it be the government or maybe parents in the household or so forth, and they're dividing up the goods in accordance with the needs and the capacities of the members of that community. Again, there's a reasoning process that goes into what is fitting and what is right. It's not just an arbitrary thing that you give, whatever you feel like giving to anybody. And then there's equality. There's this goes to a fundamental point about human dignity, that human beings have to be treated as human beings, that to treat a human being as subhuman would be unjust. So even though we're not all equal in every specific thing, and we don't owe everybody exactly the same thing, but we do owe certain fundamental respect to everyone as a human being, and that's part of justice. So obviously, if we're talking about justice, we could go into a lot more depth about all these things. Point here simply is that there's a relationship of reason to action through the lens of a particular question, which is, how do my actions affect others, and am I giving them what is due to them? And so that's what we mean by justice. And he's saying this is an essential aspect of human action, and therefore is worthy of being called a cardinal virtue because it's one of these questions that will come up over and over again when we're deciding what to do. The next one he mentions is curbing the passions. And this, of course, refers to moderation or temperance. And again, if we're getting into what this is, we could go into a lot of nuance, but he says we talk about moderation or temperance as being a cardinal virtue because even though there are many different occasions where we have to regulate and modulate, if you will, different passions, the pleasures of touch, the pleasures of particularly eating and drinking and things like that, are generally some of the most difficult to curb. And so moderate temperance, which sometimes narrowly refers to that particular type of self-restraint, is taken as a cardinal virtue because it refers to the most sort of iconic way in which we have to regulate our passions. But of course, there are many other desires that we can also talk about. And we've already seen that what is meant by this is not suppressing desires. What's meant is to ensure that while we have desire, passions of desire for a good purpose to help us to achieve the good, that we have to reason about what we're doing and check that the desires that we're fulfilling are in fact good and are in fact contributing to the good. So this is the third cardinal virtue, moderation or temperance, which means that we are regulating our desires in accordance with the good. Now, we've already seen that there's a different kind of passion other than desiring passion, which is a spirited passion, a passion of resistance, of opposition, of overcoming, of competition. And so it's easy to see now the logic by which that's going to be the last cardinal virtue, which will be courage or fortitude, which again is not the only virtue that we could talk about in terms of spiritedness, but it's the iconic one. We'll see in a minute two different ways that you can peg these virtues as cardinal in relation to the other virtues. But here we're talking about the virtues of spiritedness, the good of being firm and holding to the good. So when the good is difficult, as he had said before, the spiritedness, when the good is difficult, we need spiritedness. This is what the virtue of courage or fortitude is all about, holding firm to the good. But again, it's the good defined by reason. Spiritedness can get out of control. We can become enraged. We can become obsessed with, conquering and achieving things. And we can lose sight of what is the reason why we're doing this. And is it even good at all? We can end up doing those things for bad reasons. So the virtuous application of spiritedness is in accordance with the good as defined by reason. That's what holds all of these cardinal virtues together. Prudence is reasoning well about what is good to do. And justice is reasoning well about what is good to do in relation to others, in terms of how my actions will affect others. Am I affecting other people in a good way? And temperance or moderation is regulating desires in accordance with what is good. And courage or fortitude is regulating spiritedness in accordance with what is good. Am I standing firm for what is good? Am I fighting for what is good? Am I overcoming obstacles to something that is good and is actually worth, overcoming those obstacles? Now, this is chiefly found in perils of death. That's the most extreme, the most, again, iconic sort of form, is when our life is in danger. Do we keep a level head? And do we do what is reasonable and good, despite the fact that it could be scary in some circumstances to do what is reasonable and good? That's what courage essentially means. It's not just doing dangerous things, because that could be stupid, that could be rash rather than courageous. And it's obviously not being cowardly, running away. What defines the middle ground there is that it is doing what reason tells us is good, even though there's a risk to our life that would easily make us panic and short circuit the reasoning process. So we see that the four cardinal virtues are in in any case, they're defined by how we perfect reason and its application to human acts and the four different ways that that comes up. Now, how do they relate to the other virtues? We've seen that's why we call them cardinal, because all the other virtues hinge on these ones. How does that work? There's two different ways of explaining that. They are not strictly compatible with each other. There's actually two different ways of using the term. And interestingly, Aquinas does not pick one and say this is the right answer. He gives us both, and he says that these are both good answers. So I think it's a really instructive thing about Aquinas, that we can see that Aquinas is not by any stretch trying to produce some kind of an airtight, system that just gives us answers for every question. Aquinas is simply trying to understand the nature of things. And secondarily, I would say he's trying to understand, the best of the wisdom that's out there that can help to guide us. And so when he sees that there's two different answers to something and they're both equally good and helpful, he doesn't try to say, well, I'm the decider. I'm the one who's going to decide which is the answer for all time. He simply explains it both ways and says these are both good. So the first explanation is that the cardinal virtues, in a certain sense, could be taken as generic. That is, they actually include all the other virtues. So there literally would only be these four virtues. All the other virtues would be translatable into these four. And so this is a way of looking at it in terms of the common formal principles. Because these are the four different ways that we are virtuous when we act, every other virtue can be plugged into one of these. So he says, for instance, any virtue that causes good in reason's active consideration, any virtue that's basically thinking well about what to do, could be called prudence. Now, in the other answer, we'll see there are other types of virtues of thinking, of practical thinking, other than prudence. Prudence is just the most important of them. But here he's saying, you could just call all of them prudence. You could say they're all different forms of prudence. Likewise, every virtue that causes the good of right and due in operation, that is, giving what's owed to others, could be called justice. So there will be other virtues that are more particular about how we relate to other people, but he's saying you could just label them all as different forms of justice. Every time that we treat others the way that we ought to treat them, you can call that justice. Every virtue that curbs and represses the passions could be called temperance, no matter which passion we're talking about. Every virtue that strengthens the mind against any passions, whatever, could be called fortitude. So in other words, anything that's hard and painful and we overcome it, you could call that courage or fortitude, even if our life is not in danger. And he says many, both holy doctors and also philosophers, speak about these virtues in this sense. And in this way, the other virtues are contained under them. And so insofar as the objectors were assuming that was wrong to think that way, he says that they were making a mistake. It's perfectly fine to speak this way about the cardinal virtues. However, Aquinas also wants to develop this alternative. And according to this alternative view, the cardinal virtues can be considered as the most important among the virtues, but they're still condivided with the others, as he puts it. In other words, they're still specific virtues, and they're not the same as some of these other virtues, but they are the most important within certain categories. So if we look at it this way, we would categorize all the virtues as being virtues in the same category as prudence, virtues in the same category as justice, and so forth. And then justice and prudence would still be separate, different virtues from those others in the category, but they would be the primary virtues within that category. So what would that look like if we did that? It would be saying that prudence is the virtue which commands. So there are other virtues of reasoning, but the command in practical matters, the command looms as the most important thing, and therefore prudence, which is commanding, would be the most important of those virtues of practical reasoning. Justice would specifically be the virtue about due actions between equals. So sometimes my relationship to somebody is not solely governed by our equality as human beings. More particular relationships might have more particular things, like a parent to a child, or a child to a parent, a ruler to the ruled, or something like that. They are equal as human beings, but that's not the most relevant thing in their relationship and in their interactions. There's a more particular thing that demands more particular. A parent has a duty to care for, say, like a 5-year-old. The 5-year-old does not have a duty to take care of the parent. So they're not equal in that sense. It doesn't mean they're not equal as human beings. It just means that what's relevant to their relationship is something that is not based on the equality between them. It's based on a different aspect of reality. So the point here is that justice, in a narrow sense, in a specific sense, would be about these interchanges among equal human beings per se, and those other things that relate to other relationships would just be in the same category as justice, but not the same. Temperance could be looked at as strictly about pleasures of touch, and that doesn't mean that regulating other passions is not important, but again, it would be looked at as separate within the same category. And finally, fortitude could be looked at as strictly about matters of life and death, and other similar virtues could pertain to other dangers or difficulties that we have to overcome. So to sum up, we see that the cardinal virtues are cardinal because they're either the most important or because they generally encompass all of the other virtues. And that's because they capture the essence of what virtue is. Virtue is the application of reason to our actions in order to achieve what is good. And there's 4 different fundamental ways that has to happen. First, the challenge of reasoning well about what is good, prudence. Second, looking at how our actions affect other people, that's justice. Third, regulating passions of desire, making sure that we are following desire in a reasonable way, that's temperance. And finally, regulating passions of spiritedness, making sure that we're dealing with challenges and threats in a way that is reasonable and good, and that is fortitude. So next time we'll move on and we'll look at the supernatural virtues, and we'll be able to apply Aquinas' thoughts about faith and reason, nature and grace, and see how this specifically applies to the practice of a virtuous life.